All right, well, I guess we'll get started with this next panel. We'll let everyone introduce themselves, but just want to say you've heard a lot of themes about regulation and regulatory certainty. So we have a panel of folks who are very familiar with regulation. I think everyone in financial services requires some literacy in what we do day to day. So I guess we'll start down with Jonathan, if you don't mind giving a little bit about your background and what you're up to now.
Sure. So I've spent a bunch of time at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in both the legal and bank supervision group, as well as some time at American Express in regulatory affairs, as well as international banking, and more recently at a B2B fintech. So sort of a bit of a mixture of things, and delighted to be here.
Cool. Hi, I'm Laura Navaratnam, so I sit on the UK board of Zero Hash as a NED. Outside of that, I'm a digital assets consultant. I used to be at the FCA for about 7.5 years, ran their fintech program, so all aspects of firm support, including crypto asset policy, so sorry about that.
We can forgive you because you left and you're here. Hi, I'm Simone Maney. I'm the CEO of Elliptic. We're a blockchain analytics firm that works with crypto businesses, fintech and payments companies, and traditional financial institutions to help them manage their anti-money laundering risks in crypto.
I'm George Morris. I'm a partner at Simmons and Simmons. We're an international law firm. I've been working in the crypto sector for about 9 years now, advised some of the largest firms in the world in this sector on international structuring, regulatory compliance, enforcement via regulators, new regulatory change, all of that kind of thing.
All right, thanks everyone. So I guess with that background in mind, we'll start with a little bit of a US, UK, EU tour of things today. Laura, the UK is taking what I call a phased approach. Do you mind just kind of covering what those phases mean right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And the election has kind of thrown all this up in the air a little bit. So I'll give a bit of an overview because you would be very much forgiven for not tracking what's happening at the moment. So the kind of current state is that most crypto asset firms in this country are not regulated properly by the FCA. There is primary legislation has been laid to amend that, so certain stablecoin activities, issuance and custody will come into the regulatory perimeter for the FCA. The FCA and the Bank of England have published discussion papers on what a regulatory regime for stablecoins might look like. The election has come at exactly the wrong time, unfortunately, because we were just waiting on some kind of final secondary legislation to give the regulators the power they need to regulate these firms. But now we're in a period of parliamentary purdah. We'll then have an election, then there'll be summer recess. So basically, we have to wait until these new pieces of legislation are kind of laid. Then we will see a consultation paper from the FCA. So the progress is being made in the UK, but it is unfortunately quite slow. Some of that is not within the gift of the regulator. They can't help that there's an election. But we're not even at phase one yet. Is the truth of it? Still, the only thing that's really biting on firms at the moment is financial promotions, and that's quite a broad regime. And really, that's an interim measure until what I will call a proper regulatory regime is in place. So even in a very optimistic world, let's say the likely incoming Labour government think crypto is a priority after 14 years out of power. They're probably not going to think that. But let's say we get the legislation we need after the summer. The FCA will publish a consultation paper. That will be 3 months. They'll then need some time to review their consultation responses, finalise a policy statement, put out a final legal instrument. There'll then be an implementation phase. So really, even if everything goes well, we're not likely to see anything actually implemented, firms to apply with, until sort of middle to late next year, and that's with everything being positive. If things get delayed, if if there's a lot of challenge to the FCA on its consultation paper, which is likely, things will just get pushed even further. And that's just around stablecoins. That was phase one, as Treasury has indicated. There will be then a phase two, which looks at other types of crypto assets, likely kind of doing backed and unbacked. So yeah, there is still a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the future looks like.
Even though there's uncertainty, maybe you can help make a prediction on when we'd expect phase one of stablecoin regulation in the UK.
So yeah, I think by the end of next year something will be actually implemented.
Right.
Whether it's any good, is a whole different matter. But that will say that will be around the issuance and custody of very specific stablecoins. So it's very UK focused. Treasury has been contemplating whether it could or should capture kind of stablecoins being issued from other jurisdictions for the UK market. That would be incredibly complicated, but it seems like an obvious piece to this puzzle. But yeah, I think it's very likely towards the end of next year we'll see something.
Right. Jonathan, I guess the US currently has a state-by-state approach. For folks who don't understand, maybe you could just discuss what that is under money transmission laws, and then how maybe the contemplated US stablecoin bill would change that structure, regulatory structure for issuers.
Sure. So at present, in the United States, there is no federal or countrywide source of regulation or licensure for stablecoin. What there is an accumulation of local, and air quotes, state level laws that are more or less specific to stablecoin, or crypto for that matter. And in some states, there are laws that were developed for more traditional forms of money movement, like money transmission, notably companies like Western Union, where you'd wire funds or do remittances. States have been licensing those kinds of activities for a long time, and those laws have been more or less applied and adapted to novel forms of financial activity. At the federal level, and I should mention before I move to the federal level, in some states there's been some real innovation. As a matter of fact, I would say that the states have been the most innovative, thoughtful, and agile regulators in the United States. New York, in particular, distinguished itself with a very early set of laws and rules that are helpful apply and provide the clarity that the industry has been clamoring for a long time. The federal government, on the other hand, has not really distinguished itself in this space, as in many others, with either its agility or ability to be decisive and move things forward. And so for the moment, there are signs of legislation that may be put into law at some point, but no real clarity as to when or how that will happen. So I will politely decline an invitation to predict when a law will be passed in the United States, but that's the situation.
And so just before moving on, how does the federal and state structure change in like banking currently? Is a dual system of regulation in the US? It looks like we'll see that with stablecoins, particularly with issuers. And do you have any thoughts on where the federal government should step in, or should the states retain kind of unlimited regulatory authority as they enjoy now?
So I guess the party line among the federal regulators is that they are best suited to manage systemic risk. And so the reason they would advance probably is that they are only the ones able to protect the broader economy and the functioning of the financial markets as a whole. And so that would be potentially a benefit of good federal legislation. But it would then mean for many participants answering to both federal and state authorities, which is the situation now in banking. And if you ask a banker if that's a good thing, they'll say, not entirely.
I guess, George, if you don't mind stepping in as our EU expert, as opposed to a phased approach in the UK, it seems like the EU's adopt a stepped approach where you might wake up to some new guidance. on a Monday morning and need to change your plans. But kind of generally, where are they, and where does stablecoins play into Mika?
Yeah, so I'm probably the lucky one on this panel because I'm about the only one that can actually give you a date when this stuff's going to come into force. So we have the Markets and Crypto Assets Regulation, which covers the EU 27, well, actually the EEA, not the EU 27. Comes into force for stablecoin issuers at the end of this month, and it comes into force for the wider crypto assets industry at the end of this year. And what it essentially provides is that there is a new framework by which you have to issue stablecoins within the EU. And it's a fairly clear framework, albeit it has quite a lot of grey areas around the edges. One of the issues we have with MiCA is that the European regulators have sort of taken existing financial services concepts of things like doing an IPO in the equities markets and kind of applied that to crypto assets. And that's particularly difficult when it comes to stablecoins. I think one of the issues we have with MiCA is that, as perhaps may have been spoken about earlier on in this event, is that there is a big question around how the global stablecoins fit into MiCA, because there are very specific requirements around how you operate as an issuer of assets in the EU, as a operating to issue electronic money tokens, as they're known under MiCA. The MiCA only really takes into account people who are issuing from the European Union. So if you're a global stablecoin provider, it's very unclear how you're going to fit into that framework. So overall, it's a good framework in that it gives us some clarity. The one thing I always say to clients is kind of be careful what you wish for when it comes to asking for regulation, because you don't always get the best framework to work from as a result. And I think we've seen that with MiCA to an extent. There's a lot of big questions that are currently being asked and not getting answered in the world of stablecoins in Europe, because we've got 2.5 weeks for the big international stablecoin issuers to sort out how they're going to deal with MiCA, and that's still a big question.
Simon, there's we kind of covered, I guess, the Western, at least, world's upcoming approach to stablecoin or existing, but how can programs that issue stablecoins or make them available through their platforms, try to comply with these laws, and what kind of like monitoring activities and KYC needs to be considered?
Yeah, sure. And almost irrespective of where we are in the evolution of the regulatory landscape, which, as my fellow panelists have very clearly laid out, is a bit muddled. We're not sort of keeping pace across regions. There is certainly a lot of regulatory kind of fracture and arbitrage happening. Despite all of that, certainly our experience has been that stablecoin issuers are embracing a compliance-first approach from the get-go. And we've also seen that in crypto more generally. If we wind back 10 years, folks were adopting a compliance-first approach, even though there were very few clearly laid out sets of regulations. It's just the right thing to do. It's what we know we need to do in order to bring more people into crypto or now stablecoin adoption. And so from that perspective, there's a lot we can do, because we can benefit from all of the attributes of open public blockchains, which allow us to conduct really thorough, extensive, real-time tracing. So stablecoin issuers are doing primarily two things. They're looking in real time, so trying to understand where and how is the stablecoin being used. Is it touching on illicit activity, for example? So it's not a secret that there are cases where stablecoins have been used particularly to facilitate money laundering at high speed. One of the kind of trends that we see at Elliptic is the increase in the use of DEXs to facilitate money laundering. They are fast, frictionless, all the things we like about stablecoins, right? 24/7, 365. Criminals love those things too. And so they are high adopters of that technology. At the same time, we've also got breaks that we can apply. For example, in the smart contract, there are freezing capabilities. And if you're monitoring how your stablecoin is being used in real time, you can marry those two attributes together in order to stop money laundering and other illicit types of activity in its tracks. And then kind of zooming out more from that real-time day-to-day monitoring, you can also look very extensively at the overall ecosystem of a stablecoin. where is it being used? What's it being used for? What's it touching on? And as an issuer or a distributor, you can really seek to understand in a much more fulsome way than you could ever do in fiat finance what the nature of the use of a stable coin would be.
Yeah. So it sounds like, in a lot of ways that the benefits are towards compliance and the arc is towards transparency. And I guess kind of on that topic, Jonathan, maybe you can help us think through consumer safety and the way that stablecoin issuers are going to be prescribed to handle customer cash, whether it's through permissible investments like treasuries, or if there are other types of activities that might be taking place. So, what are some of the ways that issuers need to think about holding those assets?
So, I think to a great extent, but not entirely, traditional prudential banking considerations are relevant for the protection of consumers when it comes to stablecoins. So, full disclosures, the right kind of record keeping. But there's a degree of nuance that creeps into this that I don't want to get too deep into, because the truth of the matter is I'm not able to. But I think redeemability, attestations, and perhaps some of the nuance around reserving it needs to be calibrated properly to address what I would say are the particulars of these kinds of transactions. And when companies are trying to operate across multiple jurisdictions with variations in the rules that are required, and then you amplify that over national borders, it becomes, I think, very difficult for people to have a reliable view into what their exposure is and what the protections are. And so ultimately, I think almost any homogeneity would be an improvement, but there's probably a fair bit of opportunity in terms of actual content and relevance as well.
Gotcha. George, I guess I'll ask you, looking at MiCA coming into place, potentially stablecoin legislation in the US, potentially by the end of next year, or a stablecoin and rules in place in the UK. Does this introduce a new traditional competitor to the market? Do we see traditional commercial banks start issuing stable tokens of their own? And is that something you're seeing or hearing from clients?
Yeah, so what MiCA has provided for is a structure whereby you can issue a stablecoin if you are a bank or an electronic money institution in the EU. And that means that there's quite a competitive advantage for entities that are already authorized in the EU as one of those two entities to be able to issue a stablecoin, a fiat-backed stablecoin, without any further authorization from a regulator. Whereas if you're a more kind of crypto-native firm that's not necessarily authorized as an EMI in the EU, you've got to go to a regulator, get authorized as an EMI. That business plan that you submit will have to say, I want to issue a stablecoin. You'll get crawled all over by the regulators for 18 months. As an existing EMI in the EU or a bank, you can do that very fast, because all you need to do is create the white paper and notify your regulator and kind of just go from there. And obviously there's a ton of extra stuff you need to do to create a stablecoin, but from a regulatory perspective, it's very straightforward for the incumbents. And I think that's the environment that the regulators to an extent wanted to create. But at the same time though, we see a lot of crypto forward EMIs in the EU already that can do this right now. And so I think there is a bit of a race. I don't think we're going to see a huge number of banks suddenly issuing vast quantities of stablecoins. I mean, we haven't traditionally seen them issuing vast quantities of e-money. They do deposits. They tend not to do e-money. E-money is basically the framework that the EU used in order to create the e-money token regime. So I can't immediately see them piling into that market. But there's a lot of crypto forward EMIs in the EU. They're going to be first to market, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to disagree with George on that. I think we're going to see a surprising number of banks issuing stablecoins in the EU.
I really hope so.
Yeah.
Any particular reason that you feel that way? Are there people you're speaking with that are becoming interested in it and talking with you about technology that makes that?
Yeah, I think that there is a high degree of curiosity about it and experimentation in anticipation of MiCA. I think that there are some clauses in it which are onerous and challenging, but I think having a framework in this case is proving to be better than having no framework. And I think, we are seeing a lot of experimentation, particularly where you see the overlap between stablecoins and the tokenization use case and how those two things could potentially work together. I think that's where the banks are really starting to get interested in exploring that.
Yeah, and Laura, I think there's another competitor that we've kind of heard as an undertone here today are central banks and central bank digital currencies are a hot topic. How are, what's the political climate for CBDCs in the UK right now?
I mean, I think it's pretty positive, particularly when you compare to kind of other global jurisdictions. But this stuff is kind of a spectrum, and I think there's an increasing focus on the use case for CBDCs, but where a CBDC almost starts to look slightly like some form of a stablecoin. And those that were paying attention to the Bank of England's discussion paper on a systemic stablecoin, for me, some of those proposals do feel like some form of a CBDC, a sort of a synthetic CBDC, because actually if the bank is able to sort of make the bar so high as to there would never be a systemic stablecoin in this country, or it would never be, I mean, frankly, it wouldn't be commercially viable under the proposals that have been put out, but that sort of pushes more into the CBDC camp and allows the central bank to retain a little bit more control. But I do think from a cultural perspective in this country, we will go very, very slow and steady. We won't suddenly jump to it. Even when we've had political will, it's not been a fast process. The current governor and previous governors have been very much in favour of this as a kind of academic thought exercise, but how far to actually something coming out, I don't know. And I think what we'll see is other jurisdictions getting there faster. Maybe developments in the US, for example. I think you'd need that burning platform for the UK to step forward. I think we're increasingly seeing, not just on CBDCs, but generally in this space, the UK is becoming is now a fast follower, not a leader anymore. It's a kind of sad state of affairs for me.
Yeah. I think everyone would agree about their own jurisdictions in a lot of respects. We're at time, but I want to give everyone a few seconds, if you can, to kind of give maybe some positive thoughts. George, you mentioned regulatory clarity might be that your business is not viable. So in what ways will regulatory clarity could be a positive for these groups?
Ultimately, it is a positive, right? You get the chance to be able to do some really interesting stuff in this sector. The thing that's a negative to that is that you have to change the way your business is operating now to be able to deal with that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of stuff in this industry I think everyone in this room would agree that we could do without. And ultimately, we have to embrace the regulatory regime. If there isn't a regulatory regime to embrace, that's very difficult, but we have one in the EU, and I think that means that as long as you're willing to change what you're doing and to operate within that framework, there's a lot of opportunity.
Great. Yeah. Simone?
Agree with everything George said. I think regulation ultimately breeds trust, whether it's trust from the banks, trust from consumers, and I think trust is what we need if we want to bring more people into this space.
Great.
Well, I guess taking a slightly more positive angle on the kind of election and uncertainty in this country, we are likely to have a Labour government, and that does, to some extent, reset the conversation and the debate. So, Labour will come in with some different preconceptions about what this ecosystem is and what regulation should look like, which does, whilst can be concerning, also represents some opportunity for industry to be engaging. And I think we do need to engage, but on a slightly different premise. It can't be about a sort of quite pro-competition argument that used to play very well with a Conservative government. If we don't get regulatory clarity here, we'll move elsewhere. I don't think a Labour government will care about that. It has to be much more around affordability and access and inclusion, and that's really where the crypto asset ecosystem can come together and work with new government and regulators to kind of get the clarity that we need.
Jonathan, any final thoughts?
I guess I would just say that the enlightened self-interest for the industry has really been a powerful force in driving regulation and compliance-first mentality, even in the absence of requirements. So I think the good news is that it's very well understood in the industry that in order to build and preserve trust, and in so doing drive adoption and use, you need to be compliant and trustworthy, and that's good news.
Yeah. So thank you all. Appreciate it. Yeah.